All right, good to see you all again. So in this lecture, we're going to be finishing up our discussion of St. Augustine. We've looked extensively at his conception of love. We've looked extensively at how he believes there's ultimately two different kinds of love, and his conception of sin as a fundamentally misguided love, and how that leads to a kind of interior destruction and exterior destruction without the assistance of grace. That was all in the previous lectures. So today what we're going to be doing is spinning out the implications of that with regards to his conception of politics, and to use a contemporary term, which isn't quite in place for him, but certainly it helps us to kind of get a grasp of what he's at, is the relationship between the church and the state. He's going to conceive of that as a relationship between the city of God and what he calls the city of man, or the earthly city. So that's the topic of today. So St. Augustine, two loves, two cities. And we're going to examine in particular how he uses the conception of a pilgrim to identify his own understanding of how to fit all these pieces together. So recall that, markers here, that insofar as there are two loves for St. Augustine, there's ultimately only going to be two political communities. So what we looked at, or two communities, I should say, what we looked at in the previous lecture is how an individual either loves God with all their soul, all their heart, all their mind, and God there conceives, the classical conception of God is loving the being that is outside space and time, so loving the transcendent, or, and it's really an either or. One either loves the transcendent or, by definition, not the transcendent. So it's either transcendent or not transcendent. Love is directed towards the transcendent. If it's not directed towards the transcendent, it's directed to the not transcendent, which ultimately will loop back around to something in space and time, back into oneself. So again, that's the fundamental either or at the heart of Augustinian theology. How we apply that to sorry, I see the camera's going out of focus. How we apply that to the political community is we recognize that there are what he calls the city of man and the city of God. And I'll explain just in a moment what I mean here by institutional church. So in the most basic definition, the city of God is the community of individuals who love God as their highest good. They form an actual physical community. Now, not necessarily a community that's separate from other communities. This is one of the challenges and opportunities of interpreting Augustine's thought in terms of how this actually looks in practice. But the city of God actually applies to real people who come together, who do love God as their highest good. Now, it's crucial to note here that one can love God as one's highest good in many, many different ways in this specific sense. Not that one can have different definitions of God, but rather that one can be in the world in different ways and still love God as their highest good. So, for example, for Augustine, you could be a banker, you could be a soldier, you could be even a politician, you could be engaged in business, in trade. You could certainly be a part of the institutional church, which I'll mention in just a moment, talk a little bit just a moment. But the idea is that to be part of the city of God, it's about what you love. It's not where you physically are in the world. And so long as your loves are directed to the highest good and you live according to that truth, right, that your actions are coherent with that love, which if it's a true love, they will be, in that sort of cycle of becoming what you do, then you can be a part of society in many, many different ways. Now, before I get to the city of man, let me then therefore explain what I mean by institutional church. For Augustine, the true church, meaning in a Christian sense, the body of Christ, Christ present on earth in his mystical form, is the same as the city of God. So all those who truly love God, who truly love Christ as their highest good, are part of that church, who form that church, constitute that church. Now, we also have what's called the institutional church. So note here what I mean by to illustrate with these circles is that all people who are part of the city of God for Augustine are part of the institutional church, meaning the actual church hierarchy, the actual, those who actually go to mass, those who identify as Christians. And at this time in history, there was only Catholics. There weren't other divisions of Christianity yet. So all those who identify as Catholic. Now note here, so all people who are in the city of God are part of the institutional church, but not all people who are in the institutional church are part of the city of God. So what Augustine's getting at here is that there's many, many people he's recognizing, and he thinks this is obviously the case, who say they're a part of the institutional church, who say they're Catholic, who say they're Christian, who say they love God, who say they follow and believe in Jesus Christ, who say all these things, and maybe in some ways appear to be acting as if that's true, but in their heart of hearts, they don't love God as their highest good. They love themselves. And so their mere presence in the church, the fact that they go to Mass, the fact that they do wear a collar, the fact that they have been ordained, the fact that they are a bishop or are a priest or are a nun, none of that actually matters with regards to love, insofar as one can be a part of that institution but be radically in love with oneself and acting purely selfishly in all of one's actions, but in sort of a surreptitious way. He would look at the crisis that's going on in the Catholic Church nowadays and say, well, that's always been the case in this specific sense, meaning there's always been people who say they're a part of the church and who act as if they're part of the church, and even represent the church publicly to other people, but who in their heart of hearts are just are radically corrupted and have only regard for themselves and their own twisted self-interest. So just because you're a part of the institutional church doesn't mean you're part of the city of God. But if you're part of the city of God, you're also for him, right? This is his perspective, also part of the institutional church. So for the sake of clarity, I just wanted to get that up on the board, but also try to clarify things now by just talking about two cities, because this is really the heart of the lecture, is to recognize that there's two different communities, and those communities take the name of the city of God and the city of man. So if by definition those in the city of God are those who love God as their highest good, then therefore, by definition, those in the city of man, or he also calls it the earthly city, he means the same thing when he refers to it in the different ways, love themselves as their highest good, in one way or another. Now note here that the city of God, those in the city of God, are embedded in the city of man. So again, the idea here is not that for Augustine, those in the city of God somehow must necessarily separate themselves and create a separate physical community in order to be a part of the city of God. They are embedded, but there's also a boundary line in the sense of there are some people who love God as their highest good, and there's some people who don't. In fact, the circles here are made to represent proportionally for Augustine. He thinks that the true church, the true city of God, is relatively small. Now, what specific numbers? He's never going to say. He's very clear about this, as are all Christians, or at least most mainstream Christians, both Catholics and Protestants, is that no one actually knows, nor should they claim to know, who's going to heaven and who's going to hell with regards to specific souls, although they can identify specific kinds of actions, specific kinds of modes of life, specific kinds of characters that are identified as those are the kinds of ways that one ends up in hell. So we're not here looking at specific numbers and saying, here's a specific identifiable number of those who are in the city of God and everybody else outside. It's just meant to represent proportionality. Most people do not love God for Augustine as their highest good. So then the more particular question becomes, well, what is the relationship between them? We see the city of man is greater than the city of God in terms of numerically, it's larger. The city of God is embedded in the city of man, but also different from it. So how do we relate the two? Well, the first way that Augustine wants to conceive of it is to say that, look, the one thing that unites the city of God and the city of man at the most foundational level, the one thing they can totally agree upon and should agree upon, because it's actually a unifying truth that does unite them, is the necessity of what he calls peace. Now, what he means by peace, and he specifically identifies it, he calls it the tranquility of order, the tranquility of order. And if we could spin out some of the most basic examples of what that means, it means basic security. So being able to leave your house anytime during the day and not fear for your life. Basic functioning government in its most basic sense. So do the roads function? Do the sewer systems function? Does the local city level function and the county levels function, the state level function? Is there some kind of congruity between them so that things actually get done? The garbage gets picked up, the electrical line, well, of course there was no electricity then, but that the torches get lit at night and illuminate the public pathways, right? That there's enough water for the citizenry, etc. All those things, he says, no matter whether you love God as your highest good or you love yourself as your highest good, those who are in both communities seek that, want that basic level of peace understood as security, as the absence of conflict. And in fact, he even argues that, look, a lot of people in the city of man are they're motivated to look for conflict. They in their heart of hearts, they don't see a problem in and of itself with engaging in conflict, including violence. But he argues that even those who are willing to use violence always use it, always with an asterisk there, because there are some people who are, from his perspective, who like violence for the sake of violence. But setting them aside, those who generally are willing to use violence in the city of man do it in order to establish peace, meaning they're seeking to create an order in which, according to their conception of what is good, reestablishes basic peace. So all of us, or almost all of us, Augustine believes, seek peace, and that unites the two communities and should unite the two communities. It gives us common ground, he believes, to share, to have a civil life together, a communal life together, whether you're here or here. It's also crucial to add here that for Augustine, anything that's genuinely good in the city of man, anything that's genuinely moral, anything that's genuinely of such a nature that it demonstrates true compassion or kindness or mercy or anything along those lines, it doesn't come from the city of man. It comes from the city of God, emanating out of the city of God, sort of culturally and in the structures into the city of man. So let me give you an example. We can get a lot done, and I'll sort of update this for update Augustine's thought and apply it today. We can get a lot done with sort of a market contract economies. And I'm not meaning this to be a critique of market economies in and of itself, but market economies are driven by mutual self-interest, right? In the sense that parties come together both as individuals and as communities and identify goods and services that can be traded in such a way so both groups, both individuals, both entities, or a multiplicity of entities, they get what they want. And this is how wealth is generated and how wealth is then distributed according to different groups coming together and recognizing ways in which they can benefit from each other. And it only works, of course, if it's contractual. So there is a kind of morality that binds together market economies understood as principles of transparency and fairness and sort of fixed rules for competition. So market economies are certainly not by any stretch of the imagination amoral or immoral, but they are based upon interest, right? If we're just looking at how economies function, they're based upon value. And so from a market economy perspective, if you can't perceive value in something, if you can't perceive in an individual or a group something that you can get, right, that you could exchange something in order for something that you want, well, then they're basically invisible to you, or even worse, they might be an obstruction to you. So when we're just thinking from the city of man's perspective, we're looking at the world just in terms of self-interest, right? Because again, the city of man is conceived of those collection of individuals who are motivated ultimately as sort of self-idolater, purely by their own self-interest understood as fulfilling their desires. So if you're looking at the world from that perspective, anytime you come across an individual or a group or a subset of human beings that through your eyes has no value, strictly speaking from the logic of self-love, right, they're at best morally invisible to you. At worst, they're a problem that can either be ignored or gotten rid of. So one of the issues, of course, where we are is homelessness, and I do not want to simplify the phenomenon of homeless as if it's and sometimes that can even be a misleading word in and of itself, because I'm not suggesting that the problem is just the lack of homes. That's the only problem, but. So I'm specifically talking about the phenomenon of people who are living on the streets or living in cars or otherwise not living in fixed dwellings. So I don't mean to simplify the issue or to say that it's obviously the case that if we just do this, it would be fixed. It's certainly not that. It's a highly complex, highly controversial issue, but it does exist, right? The phenomena is impossible not to see. Now, if you were just looking at the world from the perspective of the city of man, then all you're going to see in the different homeless populations, and again, there's lots of different kinds of homeless, you're just going to see, again, at worst, something that you just rather ignore, that you don't, just pretend they don't exist, and do everything possible to get them out of your, to avoid them in how you set up your life. Or on the darker end of the spectrum, but it would still be within the logic of the city of man, is to just try and get rid of them, just somehow make them somebody else's problem, and that could include physically. Now, again, remember here that these kinds of ideas, they have massive consequences. So there are right now, and there certainly have been ever since ever, political regimes that act according to a kind of consistency, in the sense of they have the view that there are certain groups of people who are not valuable, who don't contribute to the good of that society, and therefore have no moral standing. Right? That's like the general history of humanity. From one lens, you see that time and time again, that certain groups are excluded. Well, from the city of man logic, that makes sense to do, because it's only about self-interest, and if you have no market value, then you have no value. So what Augustine argues here is that anything that's actually good in the city of man, any law that actually protects people who otherwise have no one to speak for them, any law, and this includes the very old, the very young, the most vulnerable human beings. Any law that's there, think of laws that protect those who have various kinds of handicaps. Those laws, he thinks, don't come from the logic of self-interest. They come from the logic of love as it's understood from the perspective of the city of God. And so insofar as there's any of that in society, that's only because those of the city of God are in society, and the values that are from that community are emanating out into the world. Otherwise, it truly would be only according to the market value of people, which again can accomplish a lot in terms of basic peace, but it's going to necessarily be exclusionary as well, in terms of taking out the most vulnerable people who don't have any value. So on the one hand, they share peace. On the other hand, all that which is good in the city of man is understood as emanating from the city of God. And we have to remember that when Augustine is writing this, he's writing it as the Roman Empire is basically collapsing before his eyes. And the Roman Empire, for most of its history, it's, how long? Over 1,000-year history. Most Romans, it was inconceivable as part of the Roman Empire. We're talking about an empire that in its heyday was all the way over into Asia and North Africa, and all the way far north into Europe up to a place called Hadrian's Wall in northern England. And so that was all Roman territory, all one political unit for a long time, and now it was collapsing. Now, one of the reasons that many people within the empire began pointing to was saying, well, you know what it is? It's those Christians, because Christianity at this point in time had now moved from becoming sort of a religion of the underground, a religion that was prohibited, a religion that was oftentimes persecuted, with the conversion of Constantine, the Emperor Constantine at the end of his life, to becoming a religion that was not only allowable, but also you could practice it out in the open, and then there were more and more converts. So Christianity was becoming, in a sense, mainstream. It had moved from a persecuted religion to, in pockets at least, becoming mainstream. But it still wasn't dominant. And so many Roman citizens were pointing at Christians and saying, you know why all of this is happening? It's because these Christians will not worship Caesar as a god. And because of that, the gods, plural, are angry with Rome, and for that reason are allowing, if not actually hastening, creating the conditions for its destruction. So what Augustine's up to in writing this text called The City of God is not only laying out at a conceptual level the relationship between the city of God and the city of man, and also how his conception of love maps up onto these two communities. He's doing that. But at the same time, he's writing what's called an apology. An apology doesn't mean I'm saying sorry. It means I'm making a defense. That's the classical definition of apology. And he's saying, no, the reason that Rome is collapsing is the same reason that every other civilization always collapses, no matter where they are or how long they've been in existence. You think about that. Think about that. Has there ever been a civilization that has lasted forever, for all of human history as we know it, right? No. Every civilization eventually collapses. It eventually falls apart. And you can point to, of course, you can point to the Roman Empire, but also think about ancient Egypt. I just recently came across this. I know something about ancient Egypt, especially as it relates to its overlap with biblical history and biblical themes. But ancient Egypt was around for 3,000 years. 3,000 years, the Egyptian civilization. And so you think of that, and you look at that, and you think, well, for 3,000, if it could go 3,000 years, then why couldn't it go another 3,000 years? What in the world would ever make something that durable fall apart? Well, Augustine's answer to that is human beings. That no matter what, for him, no matter what kind of political system we put together, insofar as that political system is a product of the logic of the city of man, which is to say it's a product of self-interested individuals and groups coming together basically to milk each other to get things that they want. And they can create systems that do that, including justice systems and including institutions and bureaucracies and all that stuff. But it's all based on the logic of self-interest, some kind of ideology of making something other than God one's highest good. They're going to fall apart. That all systems eventually eat themselves. That the problem with the Roman civilization falling for him is the same problem that's that writes every other history of every other civilization, and that's the problem of cannibalism. Societies will always eat themselves. And so what he's getting at here is that the city of God, yes, insofar as it's embedded in the city of man, those who are in the city of God should do everything possible, everything within their power to make the city of man, that is to say the state, that is to say the civil community, as humane, as compassionate, and as just, and as worthy of human dignity, living in the image and likeness of God as possible. That is, in fact, an obligation of being part of the city of God. That's what it means to love one's neighbor, is not just one's neighbors who are also in the city of God, but also those who are not in various ways. So yes, there's a deep obligation. So that pulls one into the world. However, at the same time, if you're part of the city of God, which means, again, you love God as your highest good, you recognize that the earthly city is not your ultimate home. That no matter how much you dedicate yourself to seeking to improve it, to seeking to humanize it, it's going to fall apart. eventually. And so you don't stake your whole life, either in a conceptual sense, because you don't see the state as your God, but also in a practical sense, like you don't give your whole life to the state or to a political party or to a political movement, because you recognize that all of those things eventually, in and of themselves, will loop back around and destroy themselves. So the metaphor he uses to describe that is to say that Christians, properly understood, this is the group of the city of God, should be understood as pilgrims. So you think of the characteristics of the pilgrims. So on the one hand, pilgrims are embedded in time and space, right? They're walking on paths. They need the same things that every other human being needs. They need safe passage, and they need good roads and the access to whatever goods and services are available in order to help deal with the vulnerabilities and pain and suffering of human life. And in that sense, pilgrims, as part of space and time, should do everything possible to make their surroundings, which, here we're speaking specifically about sort of the civil surroundings, the state, as beautiful and as just and as much like the kingdom of God as possible. On the other hand, pilgrims are not stationary, right? So they're moving through space and time. They're located, but they're not stationary. So what that means is that the ultimate destiny of a pilgrim is, for Augustine, the kingdom of heaven, which is to say unity with God, both individually and as part of the heavenly community, what Catholics would call the community of saints. So what that creates is a kind of tension in life. It can be a productive tension, but still a tension in life in which Christians are pulled into the world because of their love for their neighbors, and for the recognition that the world was created by God, and insofar as the world itself is therefore good, even though human beings in and of themselves are sinful and degrade themselves and the world. So they're pulled into the world, but at the same time, they pull out of the world in this recognition that nothing here is permanent. So as we move on, this is a shorter lecture because, again, it's building on all these foundational themes that we already established in the previous lectures. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about this conception of pilgrimage. So whether you identify as a Christian, as Catholic or not, think to what degree is Augustine right, at least about this specific claim, that every civilization, according to the logic of self-interest, will ultimately destroy itself, which means that no government in and of itself will ever perdure forever. And that there will be, as long as human beings are around, a kind of constant flux with regards to the stability of any particular political order. Now that flux can be worse or better, or I should say it can be better or worse, but it'll still be flux, and it eventually will end up in dissolution. So when you think about that with the United States, how long has the United States been around? The United States government is, we're not that old by historical standards, it's 1776 to now, but our government, understood as under one constitution, is much older than most European governments. I mean, many of the European governments in their contemporary form didn't form until after World War II, right? After 1945. So you think European society is much older, but their political societies are, in a sense, much younger. How long will any of this really last? Now, I'm not saying it won't last. I'm just asking you to consider Augustine's conception, which is built upon this idea that, one, there are ultimately only two loves, and that the love, if it's not directed to God, does loop back around and then does become sort of carnivorous in a sense of it eats that which is around it and ultimately oneself. And because of that, if you're not part of this community, you're going to be part of a community that eventually is going to dissolve, pull itself apart, shred itself, and then have to be reconstituted by another self-interested community, and then the cycle will repeat itself. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? I think at the very least, it leads us to this question. Does it make sense, given at least an anthropology that recognizes that human beings have the capacity for corruption, maybe even a deep capacity for corruption, does it make sense to say that we should give our whole lives to any particular cause unless we can somehow identify how that cause is transcendent in some sense? Or otherwise, are we committing ourselves to something that, if it is just embedded in the fabric of space and time and cut off from anything that's transcendent, and therefore sort of accidental in nature and temporary in nature, and just part of the natural, that's a loaded word, just part of the ongoing flux of events that happen. If that's the paradigm we're using, then do we have reason to get involved in anything? So let me end with this. So on the one hand, this Augustinian impulse can seem like these absolutes, right? So you're either here or you're here. You're either fighting for this good or you're fighting against that good. Think about whether or not there is a kind of 0 or 1 character to our goals politically, our goals as communities, our goals in setting up, as being political animals, setting up different kinds of structures for authority that are based upon different kinds of principles. And will anything ultimately last unless it's embedded in something that's outside space of time? I leave that as a totally open question for you to think about, but Augustine is certainly a worthy thinker to lead us to that question, as well as all the other questions that we've already considered. So this concludes our lectures on Augustine. Now we're going to move into the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, where we're going to see a lot of these themes continued, but then also transformed in some pretty significant ways. So see you again soon. Thanks.